Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today we'll be talking about 13 recent GA accidents. Now, the number of accidents goes up every summer when people are flying more, and we'll talk about a number of these accidents, as well as an update on an accident that we talked about last week. Last week in episode 203, we talked about an accident that was most likely caused by misfueling, and we talked about the many different ways that your aircraft can get misfueled. So if you didn't hear that episode, you should check it out. This week in the news, GPS jamming continues to be an issue, but there is a backup solution that can help. ForeFlight has new features for the iPhone, and we'll tell you why a Stearman pilot decided to take off from a highway, and by the way, he did survive the crash. All this and more, and the news starts now. From IEEE.org, that's the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers website, FAA fumbled its response to a surge in GPS jamming confusion over stopping military tests that had flight controllers fuming. Well, that's a pretty long headline. Let's break it down for you. FAA controllers supervising flights over Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas were confused and frustrated by an increase in military tests that interfered with GPS signals for civilian aircraft. In March and April this year, flight controllers at the Albuquerque Center filed reports on NASA's ASRS. The complaints accused the FAA of denying controllers permission to ask the military to cut short GPS tests, adversely affecting commercial and private aircraft. These so-called stop buzzer or cease buzzer requests are supposed to be made by pilots only when a safety of flight issue is encountered. Quote, aircraft are greatly affected by the GPS jamming, and it's not taken seriously by management, reads one report. We've been told we can't ask to stop jamming and to just put everyone on headings. In a second report, a private jet made a wrong turn into restricted airspace over the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico after being jammed. On that occasion, the ATC controller called a stop buzzer. Quote, the facility manager on duty later informed me that we can't ask them to stop buzzer and to just keep putting aircraft on headings, the ASRS report reads. Putting an aircraft on a heading adds work for controllers who are already very busy at certain times a day. Quote, busy traffic, bad rides, frequency congestion, then GPS jamming, reads one report. Limit the length and what time of day that facilities can GPS jam and have it taken seriously when we call and ask them to stop. Give controllers the ability to have White Sands stop GPS jamming during high traffic periods, agrees the other. The Pentagon uses its more remote military bases, many in the American West, to test how its forces operate under GPS denial. An investigation earlier this year discovered that such jamming tests are far more prevalent than had previously been thought, possibly affecting thousands of civilian flights each year. The FAA does not share how many stop buzzer requests are made, but the IEEE's investigation obtained FAA data detailing 4 stop buzzers over the skies of California during a 9-week period in 2017. These included passenger jet flights operated by Frontier and Southwest. The White Sands Missile Range, or WSMR, whose tests appear to have caused the GPS jamming in both recent complaints, estimates it receives in the low single digits of stop buzzer requests a year. A spokesperson for WSMR told the IEEE, quote, the U.S. Army takes the safety of its operations extremely seriously. Calls for a cease buzzer are taken seriously, and range control has not denied or ignored any cease buzzers. WSMR has also never requested or required any internal organization or outside agency to not make use of the cease buzzer in the event of an emergency or unsafe event. The FAA provided the following statement. The FAA cooperates with the Department of Defense to mitigate the effects of the military's planned interference activities to levels of acceptable risk. The primary mitigation when GPS is lost is for a pilot to use another means of navigation. ATC will assist the pilot with navigation on rare occasions upon request. Should multiple pilots encounter problems, then ATC has the option to stop the underlying cause through a stop buzzer. When a stop buzzer call is made by a controller, the FAA then has a review process to analyze the appropriateness of the action and the associated operational risk. However, an FAA source also admitted that one ATC facility, quote, expressed some confusion as to the scope of their authority to suspend operations using stop buzzer protocols when GPS testing had ramped up significantly. The FAA now believes it has cleared up and abated those field concerns. Although flight controllers may no longer be instructed not to issue stop buzzer calls when planes are in trouble, pilots continue to experience difficulty in the airspace around White Sands. In May, the pilot of a light aircraft taking off at night in the Albuquerque area suddenly lost their GPS navigation and terrain warnings. ATC told the pilot that WSMR was jamming and instructed them to use other instruments. That pilot was ultimately able to land safely, but later submitted their own ASRS report. Quote, "Being unfamiliar with this area and possibly a different avionics configuration, I feel my flight could have ended as a controlled flight into terrain." And the article concludes that such an outcome, a likely deadly crash, would surely not meet anyone's definition of acceptable risk. And in a related story, this comes from iPadPilotNews.com, GPS outages, how ADS-B receivers can protect against jamming. Portable ADS-B receivers like Century are must-have devices for many pilots, delivering subscription-free weather that helps make better in-flight decisions. Beyond data link weather, many pilots have also discovered the value of having a portable ADS-B receiver as a backup. If you suffer a serious electrical system problem, an iPad and an ADS-B receiver can provide excellent backup situational awareness, including GPS moving map, backup attitude, traffic alerts, and weather. GPS outages do happen, sometimes over large areas. There's another level of redundancy that most pilots don't consider, though: GPS failure. With receivers built into everything from smartphones to GoPros, the GPS constellation of satellites really does drive modern life, but it's not immune to failure or even intentional jamming. GPS outages appear from time to time in NOTAMs, and these should be taken seriously. Even the most sophisticated glass cockpit isn't worth much without GPS. Century in particular uses a variety of hardware and software features to protect against GPS outages, jamming, and spoofing. For a start, it can receive signals from both the U.S.'s GPS satellites and also the Russian GLONASS constellation, and they note in parentheses that most panel mount systems only use the U.S. GPS signals. It continues, these operate on different frequencies, which makes this a robust backup. There are 2 other satellite navigation systems in use around the world, but ForeFlight says, although the hardware can potentially receive the European Union Galileo network and China's Baidu system, that capability is not presently programmed into the firmware. Using these multiple constellations, Century can essentially compare the position calculated by both sources and detect any anomalies. So if one constellation has an outage or is being jammed by a nefarious actor, it can throw that constellation out and fall back to the secondary system. Century also has an algorithm to detect spoofing attempts and will ignore this bad data. This type of attack is relatively rare, but has been an area of growing concern. And they include a video in this story. We'll have a link to it in the show notes. It shows a Garmin glass panel on a TBM 900 revert to dead reckoning mode due to a GPS outage in the southwest of the United States. And also from iPadPilotNews.com, ForeFlight adds flight profile support for the iPhone. ForeFlight has made great strides over the past few years, expanding the capabilities of the iPhone version of the app, allowing it to do almost everything that the iPad version can do. Early on, the smaller screen size of the iPhone didn't offer enough space for ForeFlight to display features requiring lots of buttons and complex layouts. This limitation is fading quickly, though, as the new iPhone Max models are nearly the size of the iPad mini, allowing them to serve as a primary app display in the cockpit and no longer just a backup. ForeFlight's latest update, version 13.8, takes advantage of the iPhone's larger screen and extends the flight profile view to these devices. The flight profile's vertical cross-section view can be very useful in analyzing the flight from an alternate perspective, showing the effects of terrain, airspace, TFRs, icing, turbulence, clouds forecast on your proposed route and altitude. Profile view is included in Pro Plus subscription plans and above, while forecast weather in Profile view is included in ForeFlight performance subscription plans. And when I read about this, I upgraded to version 13.8 and tried it out on my iPhone, and it's great to see this profile view now available on the iPhone. From thedenverchannel.com, Denver airplane pilot is one step closer from making his drone dodging invention a reality. Hobbyist and commercial drone operations are only getting more complex when it comes to airspace. That means it's becoming more dangerous for plane pilots, especially near busy airports. Rick Zelenka, a private pilot, has spent a few years perfecting his drone radar system to combat that problem. Quote, it spots a drone and it identifies it, Zelenka explained. Then that information is shared on the ground. Then it's shared with other pilots in the sky. Zelenka won a NASA-funded contract to develop the lightweight radar system that can be installed in an aircraft. The prototype was just tested at Platte Valley Airport in Hudson, Colorado. Veteran pilot Randy Settergren was behind the controls. Settergren said, it's refreshing to be able to see that there is looming tech out there. You just never know where a drone may be these days. Drone technology is just moving so quickly. It's making these highly capable drones and putting them in the hands of people with no formal training. Just this past April, a drone remote identification rule was finalized by the FAA, and it will help identify drones in flight and the location of their control stations. Zelenka said that new rules will make his drone detecting radar network work that much better. He says the drone community will conform and comply with the new FAA rule within a year. And I did a search. There are some drone identification apps which are available, so you might want to check out and see what apps are available today. From flyingmag.com, House passes amendment reversing FAA instruction policy. Bipartisan legislation will now make its way to the Senate. What does it all mean? An amendment to reverse the FAA's reinterpretation of flight instruction as an activity for compensation or hire is on its way to the Senate after being passed by the House late last week. The amendment, put forth by Representatives Kai Kahale, Democrat of Hawaii, and Sam Graves, Republican of Missouri, was added to the National Defense Authorization Act. It states that a flight instructor providing flight training and flight instruction shall not be deemed to be operating an aircraft carrying passengers or property for compensation or hire. Compensation or hire, per the FAR-AIM, defines a flight as commercial activity. In essence, the amendment reverses the FAA's reinterpretation of flight training policy that came as a result of an emergency cease and desist order levied at a warbird operator in Florida in 2020. In July, the FAA issued a training directive requiring operators of certain categories of aircraft to obtain a LODA, or Letter of Deviation Authority, in order to conduct flight training. The directive, which reversed 60 years of policy that had flight instruction outside of commercial activities, has been a source of concern among several aviation advocacy groups, especially the National Association of Flight Instructors and the Society of Aviation and Flight Educators. During AirVenture 2021, the issue was discussed at length by both groups as they struggled to determine the impact it would have on the industry. David St. George, executive director of SAFE, said, quote, obtaining a LODA can be done with an app, and he added that hundreds of CFIs and aircraft owners have done so. But what is most concerning, he said, is saying CFIs are flying for compensation or hire. That sounds a lot like charter pilot operations, and people were wondering how it will change our roles as instructors. Karen Kalashek, chair-elect of NAFI, said the organization has been fielding lots of calls from members who are worried that they will have to upgrade their medical certificates to exercise their instructor privileges. That's because the FAA dictates that a pilot wishing to exercise commercial pilot privileges must possess at least a second-class medical certificate. Quote, they are asking that if flight instruction falls under compensation or hire, wouldn't that mean we all need a second-class medical certificate? We have an awful lot of CFIs out there who are instructing with basic med, she said, stressing that the FAA has not yet released a notice of intent to change medical requirements for CFIs. In a letter to the FAA, EAA, GAMA, and AOPA have expressed concerns over the confusion over the reinterpretation of existing regulations and asked the FAA to streamline the process for compliance. Pilots and instructors who wish to voice their opinion on the amendment should contact their senator. From AOPA.org, FAA expands gliders' use of transponder code 1202, that's 1202. The FAA says glider pilots flying under visual flight rules should squawk transponder code 1202 regardless of whether the flight is in communication with ATC, in a procedural change that will take effect November 1st. The use of transponder code 1202 for VFR glider flights not in contact with ATC was instituted in 2012 to differentiate gliders from powered aircraft flying VFR and squawking 1200. The expanded use of code 1202 to include gliders in contact with ATC was authorized in an internal FAA order updating elements of the National Beacon Code Allocation Plan. Quote, due to the transponder equipment used by many gliders, changing beacon codes in flight can be a cumbersome process that diverts the pilot's attention away from scanning for traffic, it says. In addition, because gliders often have very unique flight profiles, allowing VFR gliders to remain on code 1202 when in contact with ATC preserves the intent of that beacon code in alerting other aircraft as well as ATC to the presence of the glider. AOPA welcomes the updates, said Jim McClay, AOPA Director of Airspace, Air Traffic, and Security. He said, quote, gliders can make radical changes in flight direction to find lift, but they are unable to hold altitude if ATC were to issue instructions to do so. Given those characteristics, it is crucial for ATC to be immediately aware from the transponder code being squawked that an aircraft in a traffic-separated scenario is a glider, he said. From avweb.com, BizJet shortage prompts private jet rage. Adding to the list of COVID-19 related shortages, CNBC is reporting that there aren't enough business jets to go around. The network says a trifecta of factors, including an uptick in private travel by COVID-conscious wealthy travelers, an uptick in suddenly wealthy people able to afford private air travel, and a shortage of both used and new aircraft, is fueling private jet rage. Now, this is certainly a first world problem. CetNetJet told the network that it stopped selling jet cards, and NetJet says it's not taking any more customers for its smaller aircraft. The vast number of flights is taxing the air traffic infrastructure in ways we haven't seen in years, the company said. CNBC said Argus International reported that July was the busiest month ever for private jet flights, more than 300,000 of them, and it expects October to beat that record, even though it's usually part of the off-season for private travel. Those who manage to book flights are sometimes not getting the regal treatment they expect. Cancellations, delays, and operational issues that many private travelers use business aviation to avoid are becoming a factor thanks to pilot shortages and a lack of parts for repairs. Even catering is taking a hit, and it's created some disappointed clients. Doug Golan, founder of Private Jet Card Comparisons, told CNBC, quote, say you've got a client who ordered Belvedere vodka and the caterer could only get Grey Goose. So the customer gets on the plane and he's ticked off that he's paying all this money and saying, why didn't I get my Belvedere vodka? All right, so hard times for the rich and famous. From ABC12.com, two Flint men are accused of firing several gunshots at a Michigan State Police helicopter. Investigators said the incident happened around 2:30 a.m. on Saturday in the Happy Hollow Nature area near Powers High School in Flint. The flight crew members and the helicopter were not hit. The men face assault with intent to murder and domestic terrorism. Both of those charges can carry life prison terms if convicted. That unique case unfolded in the early morning hours of Saturday as the Michigan State Police helicopter, known as Trooper 3, was assisting Flint Police and the Genesee County Sheriff's Department, who were responding to a shots-fired call. Police say when the helicopter arrived, two men on a footbridge in Happy Hollow Nature area turned their attention to the aircraft. Quote, if you watch the video from the helicopter, you can see these two individuals pointing the gun right at the helicopter and shooting, and the pilot says right along with the video, now they are shooting at the aircraft. The flight crew was able to direct officers on the ground to the suspected shooters and 26-year-old Jeremy Engelman and 26-year-old David Cox. Both of Flint were arrested for each firing shots at the helicopter. They've been arraigned on 8 criminal counts each, including 2 charges of assault with intent to murder the 2 crew members and domestic terrorism. The bonds for the men were set at $50,000. And finally, from KFDM.com, which I believe is a TV station in Texas, FAA says plane lost power when it struck line and crashed on Highway 124 in Winnie, Texas. No one was hurt when a single-engine Boeing PT-17, known as a Stearman biplane, crashed Saturday morning while the pilot was trying to take off from State Highway 124 at the Rice Festival parade site in Winnie. A preliminary crash report filed by the FAA states that the Boeing PT-17 aircraft was, quote, departing from a road and lost power and struck a power line in Winnie, Texas. It indicates that the only person on the plane, the pilot, sustained minor injuries, and there was substantial damage to the plane. Sheriff Brian Hawthorne tells KFDM the plane had been towed to the parade and was on a trailer while taking part in the parade. The pilot decided to fly back to the airport due to approaching rain. Sheriff Hawthorne tells KFDM no one from his office nor the Rice Festival thought it was a good idea. Sheriff's deputies stopped traffic and the pilot tried to take off from the highway. The plane was in the air when it appeared to clip cables holding up traffic lights on State Highway 124 near Broadway. The plane crashed and landed upside down on the grassy median. And in a separate post on Facebook from Kevin Steele TV, who I think is a retired anchorman, he said Chambers County investigators are trying to determine if charges against the pilot are appropriate and if permission was granted to that pilot before takeoff. And of course, this was all caught on a cell phone video, and we'll have a link to that very short flight in our show notes. By the way, we've talked about these kinds of crashes before. As I recall, a few years ago, a Cessna 210 was taking off from a highway. Before he took off, an ambulance driver asked the pilot if he should move his ambulance that was parked on the side of the road. The pilot said there was no need to move the ambulance, and of course he crashed on takeoff after hitting the ambulance. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, we'll talk about 13 recent GA accidents, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's talk about some recent accidents. This first one, when I first heard about it last month of September, it was very confusing to me. You may have read about it. It was a Cessna Citation in Connecticut that took off but then crashed into a building less than a quarter of a mile away. And I didn't talk about it because I couldn't even imagine how that could have happened. Well, it turns out the aircraft really didn't get very high into the air. Here's the story. This comes from planeandpilotmag.com. Cessna Citation 560 XLS that crashed in Farmington, Connecticut on September 2nd, 2021, after having just taken off from Plainsville-Robertson Field, likely took off with its parking brake on, according to an NTSB preliminary report. The report quoted witnesses who were concerned by what they saw on the takeoff roll. Quote, 2 witnesses observed the takeoff roll, with one reporting the airplane was going slower than they had seen during previous takeoffs. When the airplane was about 2/3 down the runway, one witness noticed a puff of blue-colored smoke from the backside of the airplane. The other witness stated that the nose landing gear was still on the ground as the airplane passed a taxiway intersection near the midpoint of the runway, and he said to a friend with him that something was wrong. Tragically, something was very wrong. The plane was apparently unable to achieve sufficient takeoff speed, as described by a third witness, who reported, according to the NTSB, that, quote, the airplane departed the runway in a level attitude. After clearing the runway, the airplane's nose pitched up, but the airplane was not climbing. The airplane then impacted a power line pole, which caused a small explosion near the right engine, followed by a shower of softball-sized sparks. After hitting the pole, the noise of the engine went from normal sounding to a much more grinding, metallic sound. The airplane then began to oscillate about its pitch and roll axes before the witness lost sight of it behind trees. The plane never made it into the air until after it departed the end of the runway, according to the preliminary report. Quote, the weight on wheels, or WOW indication, remained in an on-ground state until beyond the departure end of the runway, where the terrain began sloping downward. So that means that the wheels were still on the ground as the aircraft ran off the end of the runway. After departing the runway at an indicated speed of about 120 knots, the elevator position increased to a maximum recorded value of about 17 degrees of deflection. The airplane's pitch rapidly increased to about 22 degrees. Immediately thereafter, the elevator position rapidly decreased to about -1 degree, and the stick shaker, the aerodynamic stall warning, activated. After hitting the power pole, the plane, which was barely flying in the first place, didn't stay in the air for long, as it hit the ground less than 1,000 feet later before skidding at high speed into the side of the building where it came to rest. Several employees at the facility were injured, but none had life-threatening injuries, according to a report from NBCConnecticut.com. The parking brake on the XLS, according to the NTSB and a pilot contacted by Plane and Pilot with experience in the model, managing the parking brake being off for takeoff is a manual checklist task, and the NTSB confirms this, quote, parking brake valve position and normal brake application were not recorded by the flight data recorder, and the airplane's takeoff configuration warning system did not incorporate parking brake valve position as part of its activation logic. In other words, there was nothing to prevent the crew from attempting a takeoff with the parking brake mistakenly set. If indeed it seems likely the parking brake is found to be the culprit, it won't be the first time such a crash has occurred, though it's rare. Way back in 1980, a Falcon 10 taking off from Chicago Meigs Field, which is sadly no longer an airport, went off the end of the runway and went into Lake Michigan after the crew attempted to take off with a parking brake set. 2 of the 6 people on board were killed. In 2019, another Cessna Citation XL failed to get airborne on takeoff from Oroville, California, ran off the end of the runway and caught fire. The NTSB in its preliminary report doesn't say the plane's parking brake was set, but it is widely believed that this was the case. Remarkably, no one was injured in that crash, which destroyed the aircraft and ignited a small brush fire, which was quickly extinguished by local firefighters. So there's an accident type that I have not previously heard of before. So having a parking brake set can cause an accident. Now, I wanted to follow up on the accident that occurred at my home airport in Palo Alto just a few weeks ago. I mentioned in episode 203 that a Beech Baron lost both engines within a couple of minutes of takeoff, turned back to the airport, and crashed on the base leg. The pilot survived, and I said that this sounded like a misfueling accident, though that was just a guess. Well, turns out it was a good guess. I was talking with the owner of the FBO a few days ago about something else, and he brought up the subject, and he said, "You know that we misfueled that aircraft." So, indeed, the Baron was fueled by mistake with Jet A, and either the fueler or the pilot caught the mistake. And, of course, misfueling was the main topic of episode 203. By the way, that fueler kept his job. As the owner of the FBO said to me, he'll never make that mistake again. Well, I'm just back from a 6-day trip to Knoxville. A couple of those days were travel days. I had 1 down day, and then we had 3 days of recurrent training for the Vision Jet. And while I was there, I learned of another recent misfueling accident that really surprised me. The CFI I was working with told me that he came out of the terminal building once to find a 100 low-lead truck parked in front of the Vision Jet that he was flying, and that the fueler had already put 36 gallons of 100 low-lead into the right tank of the Vision Jet. When asked why he put 100 low-lead into the jet, the fueler responded, ready for this? He said, "Because it's a Cirrus." The CFI then spent 4 hours with the fuel company draining the tank, adding 15 gallons of Jet A at a time to the tank, rocking the wing to shake up the fuel, and then draining and testing the fuel for 100 low-lead. They did this a number of times before the fuel finally came up clean. And speaking of Vision Jet incidents, I just learned of another one that occurred in Sedona in January, which is related to a pet peeve of mine. Now, here's the pet peeve. I'm constantly telling pilots to not touch anything after they land, especially the flap switch, and that they should wait until they're on the taxiway before raising the flaps. The reason, of course, is that because sometimes pilots flying aircraft with retractable landing gear, even when they're making full stop landings, will reach over and raise the flaps immediately after touchdown. And sometimes they grab the landing gear lever by mistake and retract the landing gear instead of the flaps. And here's the problem. There are a lot of CFIs who are teaching that after a short field landing, you should raise the flaps, which should increase the weight of the aircraft on the wheels, which should make the brakes more effective and theoretically give you a slightly shorter landing distance. And if you only ever fly fixed-gear aircraft, that procedure shouldn't cause a problem. However, I see a lot of pilots who, after every single landing they make, regardless of the length of the runway, they reach over and raise the flaps as they roll out on the runway. First, this is totally unnecessary. And second, this is a bad habit that sets those pilots up for big trouble if they move into aircraft with retractable landing gear. And finally, if you're landing on a field that is so short that raising the flaps will make the difference for a safe landing, you should be landing on a longer runway. Now, some CFIs may say, but we have to teach raising the flaps after a short field landing because that's what the ACS for the private checkloride requires. Well, that is incorrect. The private ACS says use manufacturer's recommended procedures for airplane configuration and braking. So unless the POH says you have to raise the flaps after a short field landing, it's not required that you do so on the private check ride. And guess what? It's also not required on the commercial check ride. The ACS for that check ride uses the same wording that I just read to you a moment ago. And where, might you ask, does it say to raise the flaps? Well, in the POH for the Cessna 172. If you look up under short field landing, the very last step, number 8, is wing flaps up. And in the Cirrus SR20 POH, the last sentence for short-field landing says, for maximum brake effectiveness, retract the flaps, hold the control yoke full back, and apply maximum brake pressure without skidding. So sadly, most people studying for their private are taught this really bad habit. The law of primacy says that the things we learn first, we remember best. So if you were ever taught to raise the flaps from the very beginning, you're more likely to continue to do it, even as you move up to aircraft with retractable landing gear. So let's get back to that VisionJet incident in Sedona. Apparently, as that aircraft was touching down in a crosswind, I'm told that the pilot, or someone in the aircraft, reached over to raise the flaps, thinking perhaps that the aircraft would be more stable on the ground with a reduced flap setting. And of course, as you've probably already surmised, they operated the landing gear switch instead of the flap switch. Now, apparently this occurred before both mains were on the ground. Normally, what's called a squat switch on most aircraft, or in the case of a VisionJet, the weight on wheels or wow sensor, will prevent the gear from coming up when the wheels are on the ground. But it sounds like in this case, both mains weren't on the ground when somebody raised the landing gear. And so the nose gear retracted, of course, damaging the VisionJet. So please, please, please don't touch the flaps, or anything else for that matter, as you're landing or as you're rolling out on the runway. And if you say, but what if I'm making a touch and go? My answer is that you should definitely not be doing touch and goes in a retractable gear aircraft. But if for some reason you do have to do touch and goes in a retractable gear aircraft, and by the way, I saw heavy KC-10 military tanker aircraft doing touch and goes at the Stockton airport this week when I was in the pattern there, then I'd suggest you delegate the responsibility of raising the flaps to a pilot in the right seat, as they're much less likely to make an error than the pilot is, since they have only one task to perform and the pilot has many tasks to perform. Now here's an accident that was reported in GeneralAviationNews.com last week. It says, the pilot of the Beech 55 reported that shortly after landing at the airport in Sebring, Florida, the passenger, without his permission or guidance, retracted the landing gear. Once the landing gear retracted, the plane hit the runway and slid about 500 feet before coming to rest on the runway. The passenger, who was a pilot, reported that without the pilot's guidance, he mistakenly raised the gear handle, then lowered it quickly again, thinking it was the flap handle. He said he was attempting to assist the pilot. The airplane sustained substantial damage to the center wing spar. The pilot reported that there were no pre-accident mechanical failures or malfunctions with the airplane that would have precluded normal operation. Probable cause? The passenger's inadvertent retraction of the landing gear during the landing roll without being instructed to do so by the pilot. And I'd say as a general rule, as a pilot, part of your passenger briefing should be that people in the front seats, regardless of whether they are also a pilot, should not touch any of the flight controls unless you ask him or her for assistance. So 2 accidents there involving people raising the landing gear as they were touching down. This comes from avweb.com, their GA accident bulletin. In May of 2021 in St. Louis, Michigan, Cessna 182H Skylane, about 13:08 Eastern Time, or about 1 p.m., the airplane was destroyed when it contacted antenna guy wires during a pipeline patrol mission. The solo pilot was fatally injured. Visual conditions prevailed. Surveillance data shows the aircraft's ground track followed the intended pipeline at between 500 feet and 800 feet AGL. The airplane flew into an area containing a 1,049-foot tall radio antenna supported by multiple guy wires, the top of which the FAA sectional chart depicted at 739 feet MSL. At 13:08, the final surveillance data showed the airplane at 1,369 feet MSL and about 580 feet east-southeast of the radio antenna. The airplane's last recorded position was about 300 feet below the top of the antenna. Its ground track was toward the guy wires attached to the northeast side of the radio antenna. Here's one from May 25th of this year, Crossville, Tennessee, in an American AA-5A Cheetah. About 7:30 a.m. Central Time, the airplane was destroyed when it collided with terrain after experiencing a partial power loss. The student pilot was fatally injured. Visual conditions prevailed. At 7:26 a.m., the student pilot placed a telephone call to his CFI. According to the instructor, he said The airplane's engine was not making full power, making 75 knots at 1700 RPM. Normal cruise was around 2400 RPM, about 95 knots airspeed. Quote, I helped him with troubleshooting. I asked about fuel state, magnetos on, carb heat position, and the instruments were all in the green, but the engine was not making full power and the airplane could not climb. I told him to make an emergency landing in a field, and he said there were trees and mountains, and I asked if he was talking to ATC, and he said he was not. Soon after, I heard the sound of trees and impact, and the connection went dead. And this comes from GeneralAviationNews.com last month, a story about a pilot who experienced dizziness, other symptoms from carbon monoxide. After doing a prolonged run-up in the PA-28 on runway XX after having massive avionics upgrades at a shop on the field, we noticed slight elevations in CO in the cockpit, 25 to 40 ppm. And by the way, that's significant. Usually levels are going to run around just a couple ppm. My student and I were aware, and I said to keep the window open and keep the heat and vents closed, which resolved the issue, and the levels went back down to an acceptable range. After being cleared to depart with a right turnout to the east of the airport, the student and I briefed our takeoff and emergency action that would be taken in case of an emergency. A few seconds after rotating, I started feeling symptoms of what I believed to be from the CO. I was going to give the plane to my student so I could open the door for air as he warned me of the sensor reading close to 250 ppm of CO. That's an incredibly high reading. I got tunnel vision as well, and extreme dizziness and a headache, and told him to open the window, which is in the left side. Fearing we only had seconds before I lost consciousness and that he would be not far behind me, I entered into a steep right bank, nose low attitude, received priority, and tried to make it to the intersecting runway. I was unable to make it to the runway and was able to land on the taxiway. As soon as we stopped, I opened the door and then responded to the tower and waited for emergency personnel. A mechanic on the field informed us the next day there was a crack in the exhaust, unsure of the size, in a place I would not have been able to see. I believe my actions were correct, both in timing and place of landing. And here's another one from last month in GeneralAviationNews.com. Gender reveal flight goes awry. The pilot reported that while maneuvering at a low altitude near Turkey, Texas, in an air tractor AT-602, he dumped about 350 gallons of pink water for a gender reveal. The airplane got too slow, aerodynamically stalled, hit terrain, and came to rest inverted. The airplane sustained substantial damage to the fuselage, right wing, and empennage. The pilot sustained minor injuries. The pilot reported that there were no pre-accident mechanical failures or malfunctions with the airplane that would have precluded normal operation. The FAA inspector added there were 2 people on board the single-seat airplane. Probable cause: the pilot's failure to maintain adequate airspeed and his exceedance of the airplane's critical angle of attack during a low pass, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall and impact with terrain. And this comes from aeronews.net, a preliminary NTSB report on a Cessna 182H. They say that on August 15th of this year, around 1847 Mountain Daylight Time, so about 6:45, the sun would have still been up, a Cessna 182H was destroyed when it was involved in an accident near Bountiful, Utah. The pilot and 2 passengers were fatally injured. According to friends and family of the occupants, the airplane owner planned to take the 2 passengers on a local tour flight in celebration of their 1-year wedding anniversary. The owner had recently been awarded his CFI certificate, and during his training he had received flight instruction from one of the passengers who was also a CFI. The departure airport's elevation was 4,237 feet and located within the northern confines of the Salt Lake Valley between the Great Salt Lake and the Wasatch Mountain Range. Preliminary ADSB data indicated that the airplane departed Sky Park Airport at 16:41 and after reaching the end of the runway 35, began a climbing right turn to the northeast toward the foothills of the Sessions Mountains. For the next 3 minutes, the airplane continued to climb at a rate of about 700 feet per minute and a speed of 90 knots until it reached the entrance to a canyon located 4.5 miles northeast of their departure airport. As the flight progressed, the height of the canyon walls began to increase such that by 1846, although the airplane had reached an altitude of 7,300 feet, it was now about 800 feet below the rims to the north and south. The airplane then entered a 1 mile wide bowl at the end of the canyon, where for the last 8 seconds it slowed to about 64 knots and turned left to the north. The wreckage was located at an elevation of 7,225 feet. Throughout the day of the accident, a forest fire had resulted in smoke and reduced visibility within the entire Salt Lake City area. The closest aviation weather observation station to the accident site was at Salt Lake City International Airport, 14 miles southwest. An aviation routine weather report was recorded at 1854 and indicated visibility of 5 miles with moderate smoke and haze. And this comes from mustreadalaska.com. Close call. FAA report shows one Cessna left tire marks on the other midair on Saturday. A midair collision with minor damage near Anchorage between two Cessnas was reported by the FAA. The incident happened on September 4th of this year. A Cessna 185 was reported to have had to dive in midair to avoid a Cessna 182, according to the FAA's incident reporting system. Quote, aircraft in flight damaged wingtip and left tire marks on November 737 DM, Anchorage, Alaska, reads one line of the incident summary. Another line reads, aircraft dove to avoid another aircraft, November 21132, landed and post-flight inspection revealed wingtip damage with tire marks, Anchorage, Alaska. Both incidents were reported to have happened in the late evening. The Cessna 182F Skywagon, a float plane, left Lake Hood in Anchorage at 6:50 p.m. for a 30-minute flight. It was struck by the Cessna 182P Skylane, a wheeled airplane which is registered to an Aniak, Alaska address. Few other details were available, but apparently both planes were able to land without anything other than black tire scuffs and minor damage on the wing of the Skywagon. Lake Hood is the busiest seaplane in the world with nearly 200 daily operations. And here's a story from GeneralAviationNews.com from last month. Aborted go-around bends diamond. The pilot reported he intended to do touch-and-goes in the traffic pattern at the airport in Mesa, Arizona. While on the downwind leg, the air traffic controller cleared him to land. During the landing roll, past the halfway point on the runway, he increased the engine power to full to take off and told the controller that he was doing a go-around. The controller immediately instructed him to exit the runway onto the last taxiway, so the pilot cut the entire power, applied brakes and full right rudder, but the Diamond DA-40 skidded, exited the runway, and hit a concrete barrier. The airplane sustained substantial damage to the forward lower fuselage. The pilot noted that he wanted to do touch and goes, but did not accurately communicate his intentions to the air traffic controller. Probable cause, the pilot's decision to abort a go-around with insufficient runway remaining to safely stop the airplane, which resulted in a loss of control, runway excursion, and impact with a concrete barrier. And from avweb.com, their General Aviation Accident Bulletin, they report on this accident from June 17, 2021 in Rush Valley, Utah, Piper PA-28 Cherokee 140, at about 22:53 Mountain Time, so that's nearly 11 p.m., close to midnight. The airplane was destroyed when it apparently flew into terrain during controlled flight. The pilot and passenger were fatally injured. Visual night conditions prevailed. While en route, the airplane began a meandering track skirting the Mode C Vale to the west of Salt Lake City. At 22:45, the radar target crossed over a mountain range at 8,200 feet MSL, clearing terrain by just 400 feet vertically. The target then flew south over foothills, where at one point it came within 100 foot vertically and horizontally of terrain. The last radar target was recorded at 22:53 and depicted the airplane about 3/4 of a mile short of a 10,330 foot high mountain peak. The aircraft was at that time at 8,200 feet and 98 knots. What a tragic accident that could have been avoided if the pilots were using some type of application or something else to make themselves aware of the terrain that was above them. And of course, at night, when it's dark, mountains are totally invisible. So you really need to be careful when you're flying around at night if you're not familiar with the area. Also part of this AvWeb GA accident bulletin From June 21st, 2021, Mercer, Tennessee, a Cirrus SR20T turbo crash. At about 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time, the airplane was substantially damaged in an off-field landing following engine failure. The solo pilot was fatally injured. Visual conditions prevailed. The flight operated on an IFR flight plan. During en route climb, the pilot reported a manifold pressure issue and diverted to a nearby airport. The pilot did not declare an emergency. As the airplane descended below the minimum vectoring altitude, ATC suggested a closer runway, but the pilot chose to continue to the original divert airport. The airplane continued to descend, and at 600 feet MSL, ATC asked the pilot if he intended to use the parachute. The pilot responded, "Negative, busy landing." No further communications were received from the pilot. Examination revealed cracking and melting at the left turbocharger housing attachment flange. A small metal fragment was found wedged between the wastegate housing and the valve, forcing it open. The Cirrus cap's parachute was found intact. Now, I've read a little bit about this accident elsewhere. The pilot who unfortunately died in the accident was a prominent real estate entrepreneur. It's unknown why he didn't use the parachute. He was originally at 4,000 feet and certainly had plenty of time to use the parachute, which almost certainly would have saved his life if he had used it. Well, there you have a summary of 13 recent accidents. It's often been said that pilots aren't inventing new ways of killing themselves. And as you can hear, each of these accident pilots were repeating history in some way. So please keep these accidents in mind, and whenever you fly, try to avoid repeating history. Coming up next, a few of my updates, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now for some updates. I've got a few congratulations here. This comes from Patreon supporter Heath Bauman. He says, "Max, just wanted to thank you a note and thank you for all that you do. I recently passed my CFI check ride, and I know that listening to your podcast has really been a huge help. I had originally scheduled my ride with Jason Blair, who we've had on the show here a number of times, and was looking forward to that, but I had to switch to a different DPE at the last minute due to various reasons. Maybe I'll get to work with him on my instrument add-on. Thanks again. I look forward to more podcasts. And Heath, congratulations. He and I just exchanged email again, and he is now signed up to teach at his local flight school, so he's looking to give his first dual instruction very soon. So again, congratulations. And I saw a Facebook message from Patreon supporter Michael Baraz, who said that he too just passed his CFI. I met Michael, I'm guessing about 3 years ago, when he was the president of the Chicago Executive Airport Pilots Association. He invited me to come out there to speak, and I had a great time in Chicago. Michael's a great guy, and I think he's going to be an excellent CFI, so congratulations to him. And one of our mega supporters, Dave Brochet, he says that he is working on his commercial, so good luck with that, Dave. I think you're going to have a lot of fun doing that. Here's a note from Jake Gibson. He's one of our newer Patreon supporters. He says, "I'm a student pilot based in Indianapolis. On hold for a bit, had to stop after about a year for schedule issues and instructor rotation. Went through 3 instructors before even getting 10 hours. Wow, that is really bad. I've heard of people having instructor problems, but that's pretty tough." He says, "Scheduling conflicts and their promotions, which is a good thing, of course. So figured I'd put it on hold for a couple years and let our youngest graduate and then get back to it when the schedule is a bit more flexible. The positive was I got to fly an SR20 for a few hours of that time. Those are mighty fine aircraft. Your show is outstanding for keeping knowledge current on things happening, and the guest commentary is wonderful. Again, very much appreciated." And then he says, "My office is close to the Indy Regional Airport, so lunch on me the next time you visit Indianapolis." I wrote back, "Thanks for your kind words about the podcast, but be careful about offering free food to CFIs. You might never get rid of them." So great to hear from you, Jake. And let me give you a quick update on my trip last week to Knoxville, which I mentioned in episode 203. Everyone who has a jet type rating of any kind has to pass a PIC proficiency check, or PPC, every 12 months in order to keep flying in that jet. That's essentially doing the original check ride over again every year. And you do that with a PPE, or Pilot Proficiency Examiner, which is different from a DPE to whom you might go for a normal check ride. The details of all of this are spelled out in FAR 61.58. So when people are talking about getting their recurrent training, they'll sometimes refer to it as doing their 6158. Now, there are no direct flights from the San Francisco Bay Area to Knoxville, where I had to go for the training. So when I fly there via the airlines, it takes all day to get there, especially with the 3-hour time change. So I was thrilled that a local Vision Jet owner was flying out to Knoxville the same week to do his 6158 as well, so we flew out together. We had a very uneventful flight going out there. In fact, we didn't pass through a cloud on the entire trip. We did, however, fly over a lot of smoke in the first third of the trip. Essentially, we were over smoke for all of California and Nevada, and the skies didn't really start to clear until we reached Utah. So that gives you an idea of just how bad the fire season has been out here in the West. We made stops at the Centennial Airport in the Denver area, and we also stopped at the St. Louis Airport for fuel. And in the air, I also did some of the editing for episode 203, which I then uploaded when I reached the hotel in Knoxville. As we arrived in Knoxville, it was getting fairly dark, and I suggested that we turn on the plane's EVS camera, which I don't use a lot. But we had it set up on the right side of the MFD, and on the left side we were displaying relative terrain. Now, I love having relative terrain displayed anytime I'm taking off or landing at night, as it very clearly shows you where the higher terrain is. And in the Vision Jet, it uses a scheme where red is used to show areas that are above you or as little as 100 feet below you. Yellow is areas that are as little as 100 feet to as much as 1,000 feet below you. And green is for terrain that's 1,000 to 2,000 feet below you. And areas that are more than 2,000 feet below you, that's where you want to be, those are depicted in black. And of course, the colors are constantly shifting as you change altitude. So as you climb up, you get less and less of those colors. As you descend, you get more and more of them. And by the way, I shot a video of this landing showing the use of the EVS camera, which I posted last week on Patreon. And supporters at the $20 a month level have already seen that video. And you can see it too by signing up on Patreon at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Now, Tuesday was a free day for us as the Vision Jet owner wanted to get out there a day early in case we had any difficulties getting there. So I spent a lot of time that day just catching up with email with listeners and Patreon supporters. On Wednesday, the training started and I had 2 sessions in the simulators, one of which was in the full motion simulator. On Thursday, I had another simulator session and some ground instruction reviewing aircraft systems and various airspeed numbers and so on. And on Friday, I did my PPC with Jim Witt. Now, Jim was the chief pilot of a flight school in Merced, California for a number of years, and he also ran various other flight schools. I believe he said he's typed in 10 different jets, and I know he did a lot of corporate flying for a number of years. The PPC started off with an oral discussion on a variety of topics, and then we moved into the simulator. Probably the best thing about using a simulator is the ability to simulate emergencies, some of which you can't easily replicate in the actual aircraft. As part of my check ride, I had an engine fire, and after dealing with that, had to land. Now, I could have pulled the parachute, which would have been an acceptable outcome, but I really wanted to practice the SFO, or single-engine flameout, which I had never done in an actual aircraft. This involves crossing overhead the numbers at 3,000 feet AGL while pointed down the runway that you plan to land on. Now, to get over the numbers pointed in the right direction at 3,000 feet AGL turned out to be relatively easy using the tools in the Garmin G3000. And by the way, the G1000 can also do what I did. As I was gliding toward the Memphis airport at best glide speed, I noted that I was descending at about 1,100 feet per minute. I arrived over the airport thousands of feet high, so I then flew a box pattern over the airport with approximately 1-minute legs, knowing that I would descend about 1,000 feet on each of these legs. Memphis has a field elevation of around 300 feet, so I set the altitude selector for 3,300 feet, which would be 3,000 feet AGL. The G3000 puts a curved line, which some pilots call the banana bar, on the moving map at the point where you'll be arriving at the selected altitude, which in this case was 3,300 feet. So as I was flying my box pattern above the airport, I could see exactly where I would be when I reached 3,300 feet. I then cut the corners of the box as necessary so that I showed up at the numbers at almost exactly 3,300 feet. I then began the SFO procedure, which calls for setting flaps to 50% and lowering the landing gear over the numbers. You then essentially fly a miniature traffic pattern, or you could think of it as a 360-degree circle at about 120 knots back to the runway. When I was on base, I could see that the banana bar was beyond the runway, so I knew I would make it to the runway. All along, I'd planned to land on runway 36 center. That way, if I came up high or short, I could change to 36 left or 36 right. As it was, I reached 36 center as planned and lowered the final flaps as I was coming up on the runway. So it was great practice, and I really enjoyed flying the SFO, or a single-engine flameout. The rest of the PPC involved flying a number of maneuvers such as steep turns and stalls, dealing with a number of emergencies, and flying 4 different instrument approaches, some by hand and some using the autopilot. On Saturday, we flew back to California, and there was a line of thunderstorms which ran from the Gulf Coast all the way up to the Great Lakes, so we had to pick our way through it. Fortunately, the storm was loosely organized, and before we left, we saw a hole to the south and decided to head in that direction. But we'd already filed a flight plan to our destination on ForeFlight, and since we were within 45 minutes of departure, it wouldn't let us update the flight plan. Now, we could have asked for a reroute in the air, but I really like making those kinds of changes on the ground whenever possible. So I phoned 1-800-WX-BRIEF as we were taxiing out to the runway to see what they could do for us. The briefer called center, and at one point during our taxiing, ground came back to us and said, "Do you have any idea why your flight plan just dropped out of the system?" We told them then what we were trying to do, and they offered to enter the flight plan for us. Meanwhile, the briefer passed along an important tip I hadn't heard, and I'd like to share with you. He said if you're in that 45-minute window and can't change your flight plan in ForeFlight, just change the departure time by 1 minute, and then you should be able to make a change to your flight plan. Great tip, but I'll try that out on a future flight. On that first leg, we used the onboard weather radar quite a bit. We were constantly comparing it to the NEXRAD data on our Sirius XM weather that was displayed next to the radar. This was a fairly weak storm, so we didn't get a lot of information from the radar that we didn't already see on NEXRAD, but it was good to be able to compare the two. I'll post a photo I took of the radar display next to the NEXRAD display when I post the show notes for this episode 204 on Patreon, and so anyone who's signed up on Patreon at the $4 level or above will be able to see that photo. Since we had diverted so far to the south, we changed our destination to Austin, Texas, and after we landed, I took a video of a Honda Jet as it taxied up next to us at the FBO. It was painted bright yellow, so it looked pretty amazing. I posted that video on my Facebook page, so you may want to go check it out there. The rest of the trip home was uneventful. Since then, I've had a really busy flying schedule, flying with my clients who are working on various ratings in the SR20s and SR22s. Right now, I think I've got, 3 people who are working on their privates, 2 people who are working on their commercials. No instrument ratings at the moment. I've also done a little bit of flying in the brand new DA42NG-6 that just arrived at the club, as I'm the person that is checking out other instructors in that club in that aircraft. So that's been kind of fun, doing something a little bit different. And as you know, this is a listener-supported show. We've talked about having advertising here, and we might end up doing that sometime in the future. But for the moment, it's supported by people like you and people like Hans-Peter Quote from Germany. He's just joined us at €10 per month. Thanks so much for that. Bravo Whiskey edited his pledge up to $8 a month. And Chris Fenelon, who's down under there in Australia, edited his pledge up to $11 a month. We also had a one-time donation on PayPal from Anthony Staley, who donated $35 and said, "Great show." Thanks so much. And thanks to everyone for their contributions and any support that they provide to the show. If you'd like to support the show, there are all kinds of ways to do it. You can do that financially, either through Patreon, where you can sign up at a monthly level, and you'll get a few goodies for that, which are described on the website. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. You can also make donations via PayPal, and you don't need a PayPal account to do it. You can make a one-time donation or a monthly donation via PayPal. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And you can also support the show by just leaving us a review. Go into whatever podcast player that you're listening to us now on and leave a review, hopefully 5 stars, and mention what it is that you like about the show. And thanks to everyone who supports the show in whatever way you do. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.